Well, hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Goode. I set up this podcast to provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that was connected to workplace conflict or situations outside of work. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that would be useful for you, please consider pressing subscribe. In the episode today, I'm going to be looking at a case study. It is about a neighbourhood dispute. Here we have two of your neighbours who are in conflict. It's actually two of my neighbours because I've based it on an actual situation that's going on in my street at the moment. And we've got one person who's driving too fast around houses that have young children. I decided to talk about this particular topic for a couple of different reasons. First, as I mentioned, two of my neighbours are in conflict about this particular issue at the moment. As I'll explain in the episode today, one of my neighbours went and approached the other one, knocked on their door and said, effectively, can you stop driving too fast? But as I'll explain, that wasn't exactly the language that I suspect that they used. And then they didn't get the kind of reaction they were hoping for. The person became very angry and came out of the house and started a bit of an altercation. So I'm going to give an overview of that situation, sort of de-identifying it so that I'm not revealing too much about the actual people that are involved, but talk through that kind of situation because, as I mentioned, it's so relevant at the moment locally. But I also frequently get questions about this topic when I'm running conflict resolution training. This is usually in organisations, so I've got 15 or 20 or 30 people or whatever in the room. We're in the middle of a training workshop. I'm delivering, I've got PowerPoint slides and they've all got handouts and we're in small groups and this kind of thing. And then often in the break, we're having a coffee or something, someone will come up to me and say, can I just ask you about this other thing? And there are a few particular themes I've noticed that tend to emerge. Of course, ex-partners is an extremely common one. Like, can I just ask you about my ex-partner? Can I just tell you about my ex-partner? Is probably more of a common way that plays out, but I usually do my best to listen. I think probably just to normalize some of the challenges that they're facing maybe. And then they also often talk about neighborhood disputes. And one of them is driving too fast. I do hear other kinds of issues around neighbourhood disputes as well. They might talk about music being played or apartment buildings where the people down below you are smoking or something like that. And of course, these kind of things can be very irritating. But with people driving too fast, I think for a lot of people that are involved in that kind of conflict, the stakes are higher. As the person who's worried about the speeding, the dangerous driving from your perspective, it seems like the stakes are extremely high. It's literally a matter of life and death. And then from the person who's being asked to slow down, if we just imagine that they might perceive the way that comes across as criticising them or threatening them in some other way, then of course the stakes are high for them too, because they're not just being accused of being inconsiderate, like having a cigarette on their balcony when it's against the strata rules. They're being accused of potentially killing kids. So, it's perfectly understandable why there's such a high level of emotion running around this particular topic. So what I thought could be helpful was talk about this situation. I'm going to break it down in more, smaller chunks. So talk through one section and then discuss, as opposed to when I've done case studies in the podcast previously, I usually read the whole thing and then spend some time analysing it and talking about different options and next steps, etc. And I'd love to hear from you if you've dealt with a similar kind of situation yourself. What did you find helpful back then? And just the general approach that I take in the podcast today, I'd love to know if it resonates or not. You can find information about me and my services at simongoode.com. And the best way to get in touch typically is email. It's podcast@simongoode.com. Okay, so let's have a look at this situation. As I mentioned, I've changed the names and a few other details just to make sure that I'm not putting everybody's... What's that phrase? You put your laundry out to dry or something like that? Like everybody gets to see your soiled laundry drying in the line, so to speak. It's not my intention. I honestly do just think this would be a topic that's quite useful for a lot of people that listen. And even if you're not dealing with someone speeding, the same approach and the same ways of thinking about this situation could, of course, be transposed to workplace conflict or family disputes or dealing with the ex-partner that a lot of people tend to tell me when you want to confront them about something that they're doing, like you're being late or you're not putting sunscreen on the kids before they swim or something like that. I guess you could take a very similar kind of approach actually. Okay, so the two people involved in the case study, as I mentioned, they're fictional names. It's Kevin and Jim. So here's a little bit of background. Kevin is a retired man. He's lived in a quiet suburban neighbourhood for over 20 years. He values the safety and tranquility of the area, particularly given the presence of several young children, including those in the house next door. 6 months ago, Jim, a father of 3 children under 6, moved into the adjacent property. So 6 months ago, and Jim has 3 kids and they're under 6. It's not actually literally next door, but it's, nearby. Jim's household is lively with the typical noise and activity that comes with young children. Now, I wanted to flag that little bit of background about the two of them because to me, this begins to highlight the potentially different values that they bring to this conflict. Like we're talking about someone driving too fast. And one of the mistakes I think that Kevin or even maybe Jim make is that they think that we're talking about data conflict, like this is a conflict about the facts. So when you go to confront the other person, you might say something like, you're driving too fast. Like the implication there is it's above the rule or above some, what would you say, like standard of safety or acceptable, common ground that we all share or something like that. But of course that's not true. Like we have the legal speed limits, but ultimately what's dangerous and what's not is a subjective thing. I'm sure that you could pull it apart empirically and look at data on if you drove 1 kilometre faster, how much more likely are you to have an accident, etc. But for us, as just people observing it happening, I might think that something's safe and you might think that it's dangerous. So I don't know how far you're likely to get just approaching this as a data conflict. If you sort of imply that there's some external rule that they've broken, aside from the speed limit, I'm not 100% sure what the external rule is that you can refer to, if you know what I mean. And what tends to happen is it's you're too fast, no, I'm not. You were speeding, no, I wasn't. Like if we come across as this, you're wrong, of course the invitation is the other person, starts to defend themselves. So the option there would be to approach it in one of the other types of conflict, like data is the first one. We've also got relationship, like maybe you could just get to know them a little bit and not even worry about raising the issue initially or suggest that they spend some time with the kids in that family that lives next door so that they get to know them a little bit, and that might inherently encourage them to begin to slow down because they feel more of a connection with the community or something. We could approach it as structural conflict. Like maybe there are particular times of day where the kids are out and about playing on the street. So you might say, would you mind slowing down between 3 and 6 p.m.? So that's a pretty direct request. Could you please slow down between these particular times? And then if you could add a reason, it's because the kids are all on and off buses and you know what they're like at that stage of the day. They're probably low on blood sugar and they're hyped up and exhausted from studying, so they don't always make the most careful decisions. So it would be really helpful just as another element that we can add to contribute to their safety. If people could slow down, I'm wondering if you might be able to do the same. So I'm kind of saying there, it's a structural thing. It's not all of the time. It's these particular hours or in this particular section of the street or something like that. Like that's a different way of approaching the same conflict. It's not I'm right and you're wrong. It's could you please do this slightly differently within these parameters, the structure that I'm talking about. We could also approach it as interest conflict, like I don't know what it would be. Like what's the reason why they're not going slower, do you think? They're in a rush or they feel annoyed about the fact that the parents locally are not supervising their kids or something like that, so they're having an undue burden put on them to drive safely. I mean, after all, it's not a footpath kind of thing. So we could deal with it as a level of interest conflict, like this is what you want and this is what we want. I know for you, one of the other factors that would be useful is this. So if I could do this for you, then could you do this for me? But I think probably here the more accurate version is values. And what we're talking about here ultimately is something like safety. And it's not likely that the other person doesn't have a value of safety at all. Do you know what I mean? Like if I said to you, what's wrong with you? Why are you putting the kids at risk? The implication there is that they don't value the safety of the children. And it's probably not true. And in fact, it's often quite offensive to be accused of something like that. So I would take the opposite approach usually of saying, of course, we're all concerned about safety here. The challenge is that we've got different perspectives around what's safe and what isn't. So immediately I'm creating this collaborative frame. It's like we're in this together. I'd like to just talk to you about safety and what works in terms of road safety within the neighbourhood. Like, that's a very neutral way of framing it. It's not like, you've done this wrong, what's the matter with you? I wanted to come and, tell you to pull your head in. It's just saying, look, I wanted to talk about this issue. It's quite normal that we'll have different perspectives on this. This is the idea of values conflict. You could then explore both of their values, or maybe normalize and acknowledge it if you know them both. I know for you, it probably feels like you're not doing anything wrong. After all, you're not speeding. You're certainly not doing anything illegal. So it probably feels like some of the families in the neighbourhood are a little bit over the top, expecting that all drivers slow down. After all, isn't it their responsibility to supervise their kids? I mean, I can certainly understand that perspective and see where you're coming from there. On the other hand, we've got situations where kids are coming home from school off the bus. As I mentioned, their brain's probably not operating in a way that they're thinking very rationally, so it's likely that they're going to behave a bit more erratically than normal. So whilst parents might have a responsibility to supervise kids, I suppose they might argue that there's a limited set of options that they have to do that. And wouldn't it be more helpful if all of us could join together and work together on this one? So I suppose that's not something where either of you are right and wrong, or me and you aren't right and wrong, but I wonder if there are some options that might help moving forward, just to clarify expectations and help us get on the same page. What do you think? So that kind of approach, dealing with it as values conflict, naming it in that neutral kind of way, normalizing both of their perspectives if possible, and then shifting the conversation to the future and the solution. I mean, you might use different words to me, right? Like, you've got a different style, a different personality, a different context. So I'm an Australian guy in my 40s, so I use a lot of colloquial language and how are you, mate? Like that kind of stuff. And I find that just naturally smooths things along. But if I was in an office situation, I would behave much more professionally. And if I was dealing with a family with a different cultural background, or people younger than me or older than me, I'd try my best to take a flexible approach. So I'm not saying that you have to say these words or it in this tone exactly like I am, but hopefully some of those principles that I've been demonstrating there, you're able to see what I mean. So let's look at the incident. So the conflict began on a weekday afternoon when Kevin observed a car speeding past his home. Concerned about the safety of the children in the neighbourhood, Kevin paid close attention and noted that the car was the same one he had seen speeding on previous occasions. After considering his options for about 30 minutes, Kevin decided to speak directly to the car owner to address the issue. What do you make of that one? Kevin decided to speak directly to the car owner to address the issue. I mean, it sounds good, doesn't it? On face value, isn't that what we tell our kids to do? Like, go and talk to the person about it, mate. You'll be able to resolve it by discussion. That's how all of us adults do it. Oh, do you really, Dad? No, of course we bloody don't. All of us adults just get in arguments over the minorest little things, and none of us are very good at dealing with conflict. So, I mean, we just have to hope that this new generation coming through does something a little bit differently to all of us, don't we? But I wonder if Kevin did decide to go and talk to Jim about this issue directly, if knocking on his door immediately was his only option. Maybe something like putting a note in his mailbox saying, hey, mate, I'd love to catch up when you're free. This is my phone number. Would you mind giving me a call when you have a chance? Or I'm in number 30. If you're walking past one day, would you mind knocking on the door? There's a small thing I'd like to discuss with you. Like, I particularly, if I'm going to set a time, I would do it in the near future. Are you free this arvo? Or are you free tomorrow morning? Something like that. If they do know what the issue is, I don't want them to give them too long to stew on it, and it kind of makes it a bit more significant and formal and creates a bit of a bigger than Ben-Hur kind of attitude, I think, as well, like the longer that you have to wait before the thing happens itself. So I'd probably say you're free later this arvo, or give me a bell, or let me know when suits you, something like that, at least as a first step. If I do knock on the door, I'd probably say something like, hey, mate, I'm Simon. I just live up the road. I don't think we've had a chance to meet yet. It's just something I wanted to discuss with you, but I'm sorry if I've caught you in the middle of something. I'd be happy to come back later. So I'm flagging it, like, how are you? This is what I want to talk about. But I'm giving him that sense of autonomy as early as possible. I don't know if this is a bad time. I'd be happy to come back if I've caught you in the middle of something. To me, that's just a very nice way of providing respect. But of course, when people have that sense of autonomy, they're in the driver's seat, so it's likely to feel more contained. Whereas I just start giving him a mouthful and letting him know what I think. Of course he's opened his door and then all of a sudden he's confronted with this bombardment of personal attacks from his perspective, which he wasn't expecting. So, I do my best to slow it down, give him the option, give him that sense of control. And if I do happen to talk to his wife or talk to a kid or something else, I'd be perfectly fine with that. Would you mind letting him know I'm Simon? I just live up the road there in that house there. I'd love to just have a chat if he's free, or I'd be happy to come up and knock on the door later. What would work best? So from there, Kevin approached Jim's house and knocked on the door. When Jim answered, Kevin expressed his concerns about the speeding car, believing it to be Jim's vehicle. However, Jim's reaction was defensive and hostile. Feeling criticised, Jim raised his voice and stepped out of the doorway, standing close to Kevin in a way Kevin found intimidating. Well, I wonder what jumps out at you about that section there. He knocked on the door, and when Jim answered, Kevin expressed his concern about the speeding car, believing it to be Jim's vehicle. What a factual, neutral way of phrasing that. Kevin sounds perfectly reasonable, doesn't he? But somehow, Jim's reaction was defensive and hostile. Isn't that interesting? I used to often say to families I was working with in the post-separation space, like divorce and separation, I'd say to, and they were often in a high level of conflict, and I would ask them, if I were to meet your ex-partner and say to them, look, what do you like to deal with as a co-parent? What do you like to deal with as a separated partner? What do you like to communicate with? What are the pros and cons of Darren, so to speak? They would often laugh and say, I think they'd probably say that I'm a complete bitch, or I think they'd say I'm a complete, a-hole or something like that. And I'd say, oh, that's interesting, because the way that you often talk to me about the way that you communicate with them sounds like you're completely factual and reasonable all the time. So I'm a little bit confused about how anyone like Jim could be so defensive and hostile if all you did was talk about the facts. I've got a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek way that I often go about this, but it's saying to Kevin, I mean, of course you weren't perfectly factual. You did take 30 minutes to calm down, which I think is a very wise decision that you've made, and hopefully it made a little bit of difference in helping you regulate your nervous system, so to speak. But when you went and knocked on the door, there would be just masses of adrenaline pumping through your system. This is a situation where we all often, most of us, 99.99999% of us would find that quite uncomfortable. We're wired socially to avoid confrontation, to avoid conflict. Imagine living in a tribe and your issue was this person didn't share food with me, or they did something that's not good for the safety of the tribe, and I'm going to go and talk to them. I mean, they might literally kill me. So there's a reason why we're so hardwired to tread carefully and focus so much energy on these types of interactions. And we're so inclined to go into that fight or flight way of escalating when something happens. Even the first time we talk to them, you might notice that your voice is a little bit quivery, or your hands are shaking, or you can feel your heart beating in your chest or something like that. So I suspect it wasn't purely data focused. It would have been something like, look, mate, there are kids in the area, you really got to slow down, or something like that. Now, when we talk about that type of thing, there are kids in the area, obviously the implication is that you don't care about the kids. I'm not sure that would have been the best way to go about this type of thing. I suppose neutrally speaking, early on, it would have been, I'd just like to talk to you about the speed that we're travelling along the street here. I don't know what's your take on the situation, but I've seen a couple of near misses where cars have almost had a collision with kids. I know a couple of times the kids have actually gone out and talked to the parents about it. And I'm not saying it's all car drivers' fault here. It's not all your responsibility as someone who's driving on the street either. It's up to the parents to supervise their kids, and the kids to some extent as they get older, to figure out what they need to do to keep themselves safe. I did want to talk to you though about speed. I was wondering if maybe you might lower your speed just through this section of the street, because I know there's a couple of houses with younger kids there. I mean, I don't know, this might already be something that's on your radar and I'm wasting my time here, but yeah, what have you noticed anything like that? Any dangerous situations or any kind of thing happening from your perspective? Like, I like that way of doing it. It's a closed-ended question to begin. Have you noticed anything? The response to that is yes or no. And I'm kind of saying, like, I value you a little bit. Like, I would like your input. I value your perspective. And you've probably got a perspective. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to give the impression that, what's wrong with you? Are you completely clueless? Like, obviously, we should be doing this thing that I want us to do. It's probably not going to get us very far. So Kevin's approached it. Jim's reaction was defensive and hostile. Jim felt criticised, raised his voice and stepped out of the doorway, standing close to Kevin in a way that Kevin found intimidating. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Like, did Jim do the wrong thing there or not? I can very easily imagine a lot of reasons why Jim might have stepped out of the door. I know Jim in real life, and Jim has 2 young kids, or 3 young kids actually, but 2 very young kids, like one baby that's crawling, and a couple of young dogs. So I can imagine that stepping out might have just been, look, I want to talk to you about it, but I can't leave the door open. I've got, all of these little creatures that are about to escape. So that might have been why he stepped out, raising his voice. I mean, that could be a cultural difference. There are different volumes that people are used to speaking at. But if you're used to yelling over the top of 3 kids that are having a tantrum or something, then it's possible that he was literally just yelling in what he was doing. So coming out and talking to you, talking to Kevin, might just be that he was already at that volume, if you know what I mean. But from Kevin's perspective, it feels very personal. It feels like he's doing it, in order to influence him or intimidate him or bully him or something like that. And Kevin finds it intimidating. Now, that's not wrong. It's fine for Kevin to find that intimidating, and Kevin can decide what he needs to do there to get out of that situation. But I think the fact that he found it intimidating inherently in itself doesn't necessarily imply that Jim did anything wrong. And this is challenging because, I was talking to Kevin in real life and he was telling me about this incident, and from his perspective, this was completely unreasonable that Jim had followed him out, and I'll explain what happened in a moment. There's the next level of it that happened. It's not too major, but from his perspective, it's like, what kind of a person is he? I'm so much older than him. He's bigger than me. But I'm thinking, I understand that felt scary to you, but you went up and knocked on his door and initiated a conversation about this. He came out and talked to you about it. What did you expect to happen? And I wonder what he did expect to happen. For me, when I'm planning for these kind of interactions, I often find that I want to sort of plan what I'm going to say at the different levels or different stages of the conversation, sort of thinking about the different directions that it could go. Like, if he goes well and he's responsive, what would I do? If he says, yeah, fine, he's a little bit open but he's not interested, how far do I want to push it? And then if he says no or bugger off or wants to start a fight or something like that, what am I going to do there? And for me, I'm usually quite prepared to back down early on. I don't need to, what's that phrase? I think there's some old military thing where people used to wet their ammo or something like that. You don't need to wet your ammo all at once. You don't need to pull out all of your armaments at the beginning of the battle. You don't need to resolve everything about this issue today in this single conversation. It's perfectly fine to raise the issue. He gets upset. You say, sorry, mate, I might be totally off the mark here. It might even be another car anyway. I'm not sure. Look, I take your point. You've got young kids and this is a subjective thing and we've all got different ideas about this. I can hear where you're coming from. I'd be very quickly to say, yeah, look, let's kind of agree to disagree. Or even just, look, I appreciate your time. Look, it sounds like we've got different perspectives about this one. It's probably not going to be very fruitful to continue. Look, thanks for listening to me. Something like that. So in this real situation, this is what happened next. Sensing the conversation was not productive, Kevin attempted to de-escalate by saying, look, if I have the wrong car, I apologise. Well, there we go. He's done a little bit of what I said. But again, he's talking about data conflict. If I've got the wrong car, I apologise. This is a conditional apology, that if I've made a mistake, then I apologise. And again, he was telling me about this. He's like, I did the right thing. I said that I apologise. I'm like, I don't know if you did. That sounds like a little bit of a weasel way of apologising to me. But yeah, okay, you did use the word I apologise, I suppose. But you did say the word if, in the sentence earlier in the same sentence. So to verify, Kevin walked back up and down the street looking for cars the same colour in the same area. So he's going up and down like, okay, well, if it's not your car, Sherlock Holmes is on the case. Let's see if we can track down the real culprit. Jim followed Kevin outside, continuing to speak in an agitated manner. Kevin interpreted Jim's actions, standing close to him earlier and following him out of the house, as aggressive and bullying. Jim, on the other hand, felt unfairly accused and believed Kevin was overstepping by scrutinising him and his property. Again, we've got the same situation happening, and they would probably describe the same events, but with very different perspectives about what's actually contributing here and what's going on. Kevin's got the sneaky little apology. If I have the wrong car, I apologise. And then he's wandering around outside Jim's house, checking cars. Like, did he not expect that after he just raised an issue and accused Jim of speeding, that he would want to immediately go out and stop him from, talking to the neighbours about it, for example, which would be an incredibly likely scenario if someone else came walking past. Kevin is the kind of person that would probably say, get a load of this guy kind of thing. And I can just imagine that sitting in Jim's head as he's gone back inside. I mean, there is very, very little chance in my mind that Jim doesn't come back out and say, like, what the heck are you doing kind of thing at the very least. But Kevin didn't seem to acknowledge that, From Kevin's perspective, this was Jim completely overreacting and trying to bully him and intimidate him. And as I mentioned, he's older and smaller and stuff. So from his perspective, that was completely unethical. I haven't talked to Jim about it. I don't think in this case I probably will get involved. This is one that hopefully they can figure it out. But if not, I'm not 100% sure it's necessarily my business to get involved unless one or both of them want me to and talk to me about it. But I do hope that they're able to figure out something moving forward. But Kevin's got this very black and white view that Jim's all wrong, and my guess would be probably that Jim has the same perspective as well, just, vice versa. So it's had a lot of impact. The incident has strained the relationship between those neighbours, but particularly for Kevin, the elderly guy who's lived here for a long time and values the safety and community, he just hasn't been... He used to work in his garage a lot with his door open, and he hasn't been doing it as much. And I know he's had a few other health issues that's going on as well that's probably contributed to it, but I suspect there's probably a little bit of a sense of uneasiness or something like that. And it puts all of us in awkward positions as well, of course, because we're friends with both of the people, and now all of a sudden you have to be careful to watch your tongue, what you say about people, and what else is kind of going on in the neighbourhood. It just adds this really yucky kind of negative overtone, unfortunately. So Kevin's got this sense of uneasiness, and Jim, my guess would be Jim perceives Kevin as being overly critical and intrusive. But when this kind of conflict happens in your neighbourhood, it does almost change the way that you look at the whole street, at all of the neighbours. If one neighbour treated you like this, then it begins to change the positive assumption that you'd been making about the others. So I think there's an intangible damage in some sense, I think, that this can sometimes do. It erodes the sense of trust and goodwill and those types of things. It's sometimes tricky to put your finger on. But this year, for example, at New Year's Eve, we didn't have we normally have a street Christmas party or a street New Year's Eve party or something like that. And I've noticed that nobody did that this year. Like, I don't normally do it myself, and to be perfectly frank, I don't always go to it either. It's not the kind of thing that's necessarily what I'm up for and interested in doing. But these people would both be the kind of people that would have gone to that in previous years. And I know this has actually been a recurring issue. There's been a couple of other neighbours who have been in conflict previously, and one of them ended up moving away because the conflict got so intense. So my hope is certainly that listening to me go through this situation with Kevin and Jim today has been of some benefit for you. Hearing the way that I would think and maybe approach some of these different stages of the interaction, my hope is that it gives you new ideas or maybe some new tools to put in the toolkit. And even if you've got a different style or a different way of saying things or a different approach in general, my hope is that you'll still be able to take some benefit away from the episode today. But as I mentioned, I'd love to hear from you. The best way to get in touch is podcast@simongoode.com. If the episode has been useful, I'd be incredibly grateful if you would leave a positive review. It's the kind of cue to the algorithm for tiny little podcasts like this that just make a really big difference. So thank you in advance if that's something that you're prepared to do. The absolute gold standard is writing some text. So even if you just write, yeah, it was good, or yeah, it was fine, or something like that, That's helpful in itself. And if you've got an idea for a future episode, a scenario that you'd like me to discuss, please feel free to send that through as well. I've been putting out a number of different YouTube videos recently looking at workplace conflict situations, and I've kind of got a scenario up on the screen and I use my pen as a bit of a virtual whiteboard to annotate and that kind of thing. So have a check out of that as well. And if there's someone who you know who's dealing with a challenging neighbour, please consider sending this episode of the podcast as well. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for listening this long. I really appreciate it. All the best managing the conflict that you're dealing with over the next week or two, and we'll hopefully see you again in a future episode of the podcast. Bye for now.